Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 63 of Contemplating Life. After taking a brief detour last week for a political rant, this week we return to more stories about my college days as a computer science major at IUPUI. I want to talk about my mentor and favorite professor, Dr. John Gersting. We'll start with my fifth semester. According to my transcript, I took American History, H105, to help fill part of my liberal arts requirements for a School of Science degree. In general, I always hated history in grade school and high school because I could never remember dates. You give me an event, and I can explain most of its political and sociological significance. On the contrary, if you ask me when it occurred, unless it was the War of 1812, I'm probably clueless. Even though I was terrible at history, U.S. history was my strongest area, and I managed to earn a B for the course. I believe this was the last class that I took at the downtown campus. Everything else going forward was on 38th Street for the rest of my college days. The transcript says I took linear algebra, math 351, and earned a C. I took physics 251, titled Heat, Electricity, and Optics, but I remember it mostly having to deal with optics. I don't recall who taught it, but I enjoyed the class and I earned a B. And most important, I took another programming class, CS 320, Programming 2, from Dr. John Gersting. Now, before I tell you about that class with Dr. Gersting, I need to tell you a couple of encounters I had with him before I ever took a class with him. On the third floor of the K building, there was a small room about the size of a large supply closet. It was labeled Calculations Lab. I first spoke about it back in episode 43. At one end sat an ASR 33 teletype that was connected to the university's Next System 10 computer. I've talked previously how we used to go in there and play text-based computer games of different kinds on the teletype. There were also several very expensive programmable calculators on a table in the room. One day I wrote a program in a computer language known as BASIC to see how long it would take to count to 1 million. It had 6 loops that counted from 1 to 10, and the loops were nested inside one another, so the entire process would eventually count to 1 million. It was supposed to print out a message every 100,000 to let me know how it was doing. While the program was running, someone sat down at one of the tables and began using the programmable calculator. I thought he was a teacher, but I wasn't sure. It was behind me. I could only see him out of the corner of my eye. I'm pretty sure I asked if he needed the teletype, because I always did that when I was goofing off. But I might not have asked this guy, because I think he went straight for the calculator. A few minutes later, one of my friends walked in and asked what I was doing. "What are you up to, playing Star Trek again?" "No," I replied. "I wrote a program to count to 1 million. I'm seeing how long it takes to run. Do you need the machine?" "No, I was just going to goof around myself." "Let me know how it turns out." "Will do." After about 20 or 30 minutes, I gave up. It hadn't even reached 100,000. Now you might ask, aren't computers faster than that? Well, this program was written in BASIC, which is an interpreted language. That means every time it reads a statement written in the BASIC language, it has to parse each statement every time it's executed to figure out what it means. This is in contrast to programs written in languages like Fortran, in which the program is read once by a compiler, translated into machine language, and that machine language is what actually executes. In other words, BASIC is ungodly slow. And who knows, Maybe I made a mistake somewhere, and the thing was caught in an infinite loop and was never going to finish. Fast forward to some time later, maybe a month or so, I don't recall. I was hanging out with my friend Dennis Adams one day. We introduced you to Dennis back in episode 26. He was my friend from high school who first got me involved in computers by carrying a teletype machine downstairs from the math department at Northwest High School so I could use a computer for the first time. Dennis is 2 years older than me, so he had already been at IUPUI in the computer science department for 2 years before I arrived. Dennis was working on a project with one of the professors, and he needed to stop by his office to drop something off. Dennis says, "I'm working with Dr. John Gersting. You'll eventually get lots of classes with him. I really like him a lot, and I think you'll like him too." An endorsement from Dennis was high praise, so I was anxious to meet the guy. But I waited outside the office while Dennis went in. The professor was talking to another professor, or perhaps he was on the phone talking to him. I couldn't tell from outside. He was speaking in a loud and gruff voice, saying, "Yeah, it's no wonder the system runs so damn slow. We got all these idiots in there playing games and running programs to count to 1,000,000 just to see how long it takes." Oh, shit. He was the guy using the calculator the day I was in there trying to run 1,000,000 loops. I was going to have this guy for many of my programming classes, and he already had a terrible opinion of me. I was doomed. That was sometime during my first or second year. But now it was time to actually take a class with Dr. Gersting, and I wasn't looking forward to it. On the first day, it was a slight relief to note that his loud voice and sometimes gruff mannerisms were his normal state. He was a tall, slim man with sandy brown hair. He wore a bolo tie with a turquoise clasp. I believe he was also wearing boots. With this southwestern attire, he reminded me a little bit of Clint Eastwood, perhaps as his iconic character, Dirty Harry. I later learned that Gersting studied at Arizona State University, but I don't know if that's where he's from originally. But it explains his Southwest attire. The first day of class, he gave a big speech about how demanding he was going to be. I could imagine him saying,
"Go ahead. Make my day.
Fail my class." Although he looked like Clint Eastwood, that opening speech was also reminiscent of another iconic grumpy character from one of my favorite films. The 1973 movie The Paper Chase was about a first-year Harvard law student named Mr. Hart. In that film, John Houseman portrayed a harsh and demanding contract law professor named Charles W. Kingfield, Jr. Houseman won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for the role, much deserved. On the first day of class, Professor Kingsfield famously delivers a monologue in which he says,
"You teach yourselves the law, but I train your mind. You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer."
Gersting's speech was quite similar, especially at another speech he gave the following semester for my Programming 3 class. In that class, he handed us a textbook that he had written. It wasn't a professionally published book. Rather, it was a stack of Xerox pages bound together with a paper fastener. He declared, "I'm not going to teach you this course. You're going to teach it to yourself. I wrote this book. Everything you need to know is in this book. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm not going to lecture from it." Some teachers supplement the book with their lectures, but everything you need is in the book. If there was something else you needed to know, I would have put it in the book. When you complete each chapter, you come into class and take a quiz. You must pass the quiz with a 100% score. If you do not pass 100%, you cannot continue. Why would I let you go on to the next topic when you've not yet mastered the previous topic? There are 3 versions of each quiz. If you fail all 3 of them, then we'll sit down and have a long talk about whether or not you should be in this class. One of the reasons you're going to teach yourself this course is that's what will happen in the real world. The minute you leave this institution with your degree, most of what we taught you will be obsolete because the computer industry is evolving so quickly. And even if it doesn't change, every computer facility has its own standards and procedures. You'll have to deal with existing programs that have been written by other people, and you'll have to learn what that code does. The first day when you walk into a job, they're going to hand you a pile of computer manuals about 2 feet thick, and they're going to say, "Here, learn this." I'm not going to teach you programming. I'm going to teach you to teach yourselves programming. In other words, he was just saying what Kingsfield had said in that film. You teach yourself to write code, but I train your mind. You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a programmer. John Houseman reprised his role as Professor Kingsfield in a TV series also called The Paper Chase. In the opening episode, Mr. Hart was unprepared for the first day of class. He was expecting a lecture, but didn't realize that a reading assignment had been posted on the bulletin boards in the dormitories, and he was expected to have read material before the first class. When Kingsfield discovered that Mr. Hart was unprepared, he placed over him an imaginary burial shroud.
You see this? This is a shroud, Mr. Hart. A shroud. A burial garland. A winding sheet for the dead. This is for you, Mr. Hart. The late Mr. Hart.
After that, Kingsfield refused to engage Mr. Hart in any of the Socratic dialogue sessions in the class. Now, even though I didn't make any giant mistakes the first day of class, like Mr. Hart did, I felt like I already had a strike against me after after Gersting had already branded me as an idiot who just wanted to play games and run a million loops to see how long it would take. I've linked the scene from the movie version of The Paper Chase, as well as the entire first episode of the TV series, which I found on YouTube. You can find those links in the description. So in that first programming class I had with Gersting, it was CS320 Programming 2. It taught us additional programming skills in Fortran. The primary purpose, however, was to show us how to work in a group setting. We had a massive programming project that would take us the entire semester to complete. Each year, Gersting came up with a different programming project for his class to work on. One previous year, they wrote a piece of software to do the scoring for a car collector's show. Gersting had a collection of classic Ford Thunderbirds, and he had restored the cars in his spare time and would show them off at classic car meets. The scoring system for these competitions was quite complex, so he had his class write the software to handle the task. It was free labor. He probably could have written the program himself in a few days, but it was a good project for the class. This year, however, we had a completely different project. We were going to create a simulated computer. The project was called IPICS, IPICS, which stood for Indiana Purdue at Indianapolis Computer Simulator. Gersting had invented an imaginary computer that used its own machine language that he also invented. The set of machine language instructions illustrated the variety of types of machine instructions you would find in a real computer. It was designed to teach computer hardware architecture to future generations of computer science students. Our job was to bring this imaginary machine to life, not with actual circuits, but as a simulation. The project was divided up into different tasks, and we worked in groups of 2 to 4 students each. We had to create and test our portion of the code and write it to an overall standard that he established. Then, near the end of the semester, one representative from each team met with him on a Saturday afternoon as he took all of our different pieces of code written independently and tried to link them together into one massive program. It was an excellent example of how large programming projects work in the real world. As I recall, my team consisted of only 2 people. It was the smallest group because we had one of the smallest tasks. We had to simulate input and output processes. We had to translate numbers and letters from an internal system into standard ASCII characters and output them to the terminal. For input, we had to take ASCII text and translate it into the internal format used by the computer. Throughout the semester, Gersting lightened up, and you could joke around with him. He was a much nicer guy than he appeared that first day. I remember the day we all gathered to integrate all of our pieces of the program. Someone in the computer room was showing off something they had produced on the computer's plotter. A plotter was a computer-controlled device that had a pen mounted in it and a roll of tracing paper. The computer would move the paper forwards and backwards and move the pen side to side while lifting it up and down. You could use it to draw anything. It was sort of like a computer-controlled Etch-a-Sketch. It was mostly used for graphing mathematical functions. I played around with it a little bit just for fun, not as part of any assignment. I was already interested in computer graphics that early in my career. I joked with the other students. One of these days I'm going to use the computer plotter to draw the image of a Russian flag. Then I'm going to smear it with dirt, frame it, and label it. This is a dirty commie plot. Gersting let out a loud groan at my terrible pun. It proved to me he really did have a sense of humor after all. After an hour or so, he got the program to compile and link as a single module. It wouldn't do very much, but it worked. The next step of the process would be to write an operating system. There was a method to partition the memory into different areas. The operating system would run in protected memory, and the application program would run in general memory. I went to Gersting and asked if he would take me on in an independent study course, where my goal would be to write the operating system for IUPUI. He agreed. So for my 6th semester, I had a class CS 490, Topics in CS for Undergraduates, as well as CS 461, Programming 3, both with Dr. John Gersting. We'll talk about that in next week's episode. In fact, it's probably going to take a couple more episodes to tell the entire story of my relationship with this amazing man and with his wife, Dr. Judith Gersting, who was also a CS professor and eventually appointed chairman of the department. The Gerstings moved to Hawaii and taught there for a while, but then returned to Indianapolis and are currently still serving as Professor Emeritus in the Computer and Information Sciences program. So, stay tuned for more of the Gersting Chronicles. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I have some financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money. Still, every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters. It means more to me than words could ever express. And even if you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to be able to hear my stories. All of my back episodes are available. I encourage you to check them out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you found the podcast. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.